Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to talk to you about the reading I did in April 2023. As usual, I will begin by discussing fiction, and I actually only finished one novel during the month of April. It ended up being a very non-fiction dominant month, and I think that was partially because this one novel that I read disappointed me. It didn't really make me feel motivated to pick up any others, but that book was Mother Country by Irina Rain. In this book, we follow a woman named Nadia. She is a Ukrainian woman, a mother who left her home country to come to the United States, more specifically New York City, but due to an unfortunate set of circumstances, she had to leave her daughter behind to live with her mother, so her daughter's grandmother, and ever since then she's been working multiple jobs, trying to send money back home, and also trying anything she can think of to bring her daughter over to join her in the United States. And that's more or less what makes up this novel. We see the mother, Nadia, working as a nanny in New York City, and that brings up a lot of emotions within her, and therefore there's a discussion in this novel about how she's mothering this child while she's separated from her own. There's just generally an ongoing conversation within this book about motherhood, and there's a lot of moral ambiguity about whether or not Nadia made the right choice in leaving her daughter behind while she came to the United States. She's questioned a lot about it by the other characters within this book, and while she does defend her decision to those characters, we do also see that she's questioning her own choice. That question is a really interesting thing to think about as you read this book, and by the end of it, I didn't really come up with an answer in one way or another. I didn't land on an opinion, which is a bit unusual for me. I could honestly argue both sides. I think it was both the right choice and the wrong choice. And for that reason, I think this might make a really interesting book club selection. Like, I could see people at a book club being able to argue both sides and have some really interesting discussions because of that. But this is a very character-focused novel. I think if you like that kind of thing, you might enjoy this a little bit more than I did. Even if a book is more character-focused, I do prefer there to at least be some plot pulling me along, and there just wasn't much of that in here. So this was rather underwhelming. But now let me tell you about my nonfiction reads of the month, the vast majority of what I read during the month of April. On the whole, my nonfiction reading month was spectacular. Most of the books I'm about to tell you about, I rated 4 stars and would highly recommend. And it's really interesting because as I sat down and looked at all the nonfiction books I read during April, you can divide them all into 2 major themes: family dynamics, complicated family dynamics, and nature. In that family category was one of my selections off of my 23 nonfiction books I wanted to read in 2023 list. It's Inheritance by Dani Shapiro. This is a memoir. It's written by a woman who did one of those Ancestry.com DNA tests, only to discover that the man who raised her was not actually her biological father. Her mother and the man she thought was her biological father had both passed away when she discovered this information, so there was no asking them about what was going on here. In order to discover the truth, all she had to go off of were some subtle things that her mother had said over the years, and also there was one person that Ancestry.com had matched with her, that Ancestry.com said was her biological cousin. In this memoir, we see her piece together all of these little clues and astonishingly, in a very short period of time, come to the truth about what happened and who she actually is. And then we get to see what she does with the information and how she processes it all, especially because it had really big implications on her sense of identity, particularly her sense of Jewish identity, since she was raised Jewish. This was a fascinating and thrilling mystery within a memoir. I'm just so pleased that I insisted on reading this one this year. But another memoir I read in April was a lot more fiery. It was called All of This by Rebecca Wolf. This author talks about how she had decided that her marriage was over. She and her husband were making each other miserable. It was just really time to call it quits. But then her husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And for the sake of their children, and in order to be a good wife to him, when earlier in their marriage there were definitely points when she hadn't been, she decided to stand by his side until his death, which, even though she wanted out of the marriage, was still incredibly painful for her and definitely extraordinarily painful for their children. We as readers get to learn the entire history of this relationship between the author and her now late husband, how they first got together, how they got married, had kids, and then gradually found themselves in this really bad dynamic. The author is brutally honest about her husband's behavior within this book. She makes a point early on of saying that she didn't intend to sugarcoat anything just because he's no longer with us, but she's not brutally honest just about the way that he acted. She also speaks the truth about how she was not the best wife at times, but also how she felt very stifled by the relationship. I saw this memoir being described as grief and relief, and I think that's very accurate because all the emotions within this book are incredibly complex. And the author is so insistent on being honest that you get to see both sides of it. You get to see how, yes, the author did feel grief after her husband's death. She had such a history with this man. They had kids together. So losing him was really hard. But then also, she was relieved. She was excited that she got to go on and lead the life she always wanted to, but was held back from because she was in this relationship that honestly didn't seem good for either one of them. And we get to see that life she always wanted to live unfold in the second half of this memoir. And I would describe that section as a sexual awakening. It was that part of the book, the second half of it, that held this back from being a 5-star read. I thought this was going to be a 5-star nonfiction book for me. In the first half, I was really on track to rating this 5 stars, but then the second half rolled around and it dragged on for way too long and parts of it definitely felt excessive. I'm not prudish. I don't mind reading about sex in the books that I read. But realistically, there is only so much about someone's sex life that I want to read about, and this was more than what I wanted to read about. Overall, I would give this one 4 stars, though, because I thought it was so raw in its emotion, and there's so much power in her words. Another beautifully written memoir about the end of a relationship that I read during the month of April is a new release titled You Could Make This Place Beautiful by Maggie Smith. The author of this book is a poet. She is not the actress Maggie Smith. She's the poet Maggie Smith. She's known for a few of her different poetry collections. I know one poem of hers went viral online, but this is her very first memoir, and it's all about the dissolution of her marriage. You can feel as you read this memoir that it was written by a poet in what I would say are both positive and negative ways. The positive is definitely the beauty of the language. The way that she worded things took my breath away on more than one occasion. I just loved getting lost in the beauty of her words. It was really moving. But then the negative is definitely the repetition element. She would repeat certain words, certain phrases again and again and again in this memoir as though it were in a poem. I understand that she included it because that's part of her style as a poet, but I'm not sure it worked within a memoir the way it would have worked in a poem. In a poem where it's very short, you see the same thing over and over again, it has more of an impact. Whereas in this memoir, she would keep saying the same things, and I'm like, I get it. You don't need to say it again. But also, as a reader, I was really taken aback on more than one occasion within this book at the aggressive tone she took toward her reader. She starts off the entire memoir by saying, "This isn't a tell-all, so don't expect one." To which I just sat there thinking, yeah, I kind of always assume that there are going to be things left out of a memoir, that there are things that the author won't want to include for whatever reason. That's their choice to make. But go off, I guess. But then she would also choose to bring up these moments, these very sensitive moments, like when she broke the news of her divorce to her 2 children. She could have just not mentioned that moment at all, but instead she brings it up only to follow it up with, "I'm not going to tell you about that, and why would you want to know anyway?" If you don't want to talk about it, don't mention it at all. Don't engage in this one-sided argument with your reader over your boundaries. Be really aggressive in your tone when the reader hasn't asked you for anything and they can't respond to this aggressive tone that you're taking. I think what she may have been trying to do is preemptively ward off people from prying into her business later on, like during her book tour or any interviews she would give for this book. But I would just like to note that writing a memoir about something so personal is in fact inviting people into your business in the first place. And a choice you can make is to just write about what you want to write about, Don't write about what you don't want to write about. And people can and will, it's just what they do, complain if they want to. It doesn't mean you have to care. That can be how you set the boundary. You can ask, it doesn't mean I owe you an answer. That kind of attitude. Taking on a hostile tone, just like across the board in your memoir, is number one, not going to safeguard you from more people wanting to know your business. It's not going to prevent you from having to set a boundary later on down the line. People are curious. You've invited them into your business in the first place. They might have additional questions, and you can just say no. That is the boundary that you can set. But number two, that hostile tone is just going to turn off readers like myself who weren't planning on asking you to divulge anything further. We simply came to your memoir because we wanted to read about your experiences. Readers like me are going to be very put off by that tone, and I was. At points in this memoir, I felt like I was the one she was divorcing. I was the one she was mad at. I was sitting there like, what did I do? I just picked up your book. I just wanted to read about your life. So yes, Maggie Smith, you could have made this book a 5-star read, but I would really encourage you to not be so antagonistic toward your readers. You're asking for money from them. But that was the last family dynamics themed book that I read during the month of April. So let's move on now and talk about all of the nature books that I read during the month. The first of those was The Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan. This is a look at the relationship between humans and domesticated plants through 4 different case studies: the apple, the tulip, marijuana, and the potato. The author gives a history of each of these 4 plants and also uses his own experiences as a gardener to discuss their impact on humanity. His style is so engaging. I particularly liked the first and final chapters, the one on the apple and then the one on the potato. Back in the fall, I read and reviewed 2 books on apples, so reading that chapter kind of felt like visiting an old friend. And then during the potato chapter, he brought up the topic of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, which is a topic that I personally found fascinating. I loved reading this. I'm definitely going to read more of his books in the future. I'm also really glad that I read The Botany of Desire during the same month as I read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, a book all about fungi, because in this book, the author brings up several of the points that Michael Pollan discusses in The Botany of Desire. So if you're interested in both of these books, if you haven't read them, or if you're looking to reread either of them, I definitely recommend them as a pair. This book got a lot of hype, and I can totally see why, now having read it. It's very thorough, definitely extremely engaging. This author is so unabashedly nerdy and passionate about his field, and it really shows in this book. All that being said, I didn't find this one quite as mind-blowing as I think other readers did, but I think that's because this isn't the first book I've ever read about mushrooms. I read and reviewed 2 books on mushrooms not too long ago. I've seen a documentary. I've gone mushroom gathering with a group here in Western Pennsylvania. I know a little something about mushrooms. So this was more like revisiting a topic that I already know a little bit about versus being introduced to something new. Even so, this was still a 4-star read for me. It's really good. I definitely recommend it. I'm really glad I finally read it. The random book I picked off of my grander TBR to read during the month of April was another nature read called A Wing and a Prayer by Anders and Beverly Gyllenhaal. This is a look at how a number of different bird species are facing, at best, trouble and at worst, extinction, largely because of human actions, but also how groups of people are attempting to step in a variety of ways to help ensure their survival. I found that this book was kind of like Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert, which I've reviewed here on my channel in case you're interested. Under a White Sky is all about how people are attempting to combat climate change. This book was kind of like that, only bird edition. But then again, this book also reminded me a lot of The Botany of Desire since I had just read it, because they too incorporate a lot of their own stories of seeing birds, taking joy in them. All the stories that they talk about in this book are absolutely fascinating, and they do such a great job of making you feel invested in the outcomes for these birds, which is so important in their overall mission to get people to care more about the welfare of all these different bird species. I am a bird nerd to begin with, so I was primed to like this, but this was really well done. Then the last 2 nature books, the last 2 nonfiction books I read during April were both about cows. Taking Stock by Roger Morgan Grenville is a memoir meets natural history about how cows came to be livestock and also how he found himself working as a part-time laborer on a farm. And The Farmer's Son by John Connell, a memoir in which the author discusses coming home to Ireland to live and work on his family's farm. The Farmer's Son is a lot more personal. It gives you a sense of the kind of emotional investment that farmers have in their land and in their stock, while Taking Stock spends a lot more time highlighting the history of the cow and how much we, in our modern societies, owe them. If you missed it, I made a whole video in which I discussed both of these books at length, so if you want to hear more about them, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. So those were the books of April. It was a really strong reading month overall. I'm really happy with the quality of books I read this month. If you have comments or questions about any of the books I've discussed today, or about anything in general, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. Links to all of the books that I spoke about today, as well as any other links I may have promised you throughout the video, will be linked for you in the description box below. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the title of this video and that box will open up for you. And at the bottom of that exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets, like Goodreads, the Storygraph, Instagram, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I will see you in the next video. Bye.